Hello, everybody. On behalf of over 7,000 writers, translators, editors, and other members of the literary community who belong to PEN America, it is our delight to welcome you to the 14th PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature. This year, we bring together more than 200 writers, poets, artists, and thinkers representing 50 nationalities for over 70 events across the city. The festival was founded in 2005 by Salman Rushdie and others from PEN America in the wake of 9/11 as an effort to help bridge divisions, counter isolationism, and assert the vital importance of literature and ideas as antidotes to inhumanity. 14 years later, we come together at a time of strife and threats to basic human rights abroad and at home. Our theme is resist and reimagine. For while it is true that we're dealing with travel bans and border walls, jingoism and rising authoritarianism, we are also seeing an awakening of activism unlike anything I've witnessed in my adult life. Writers, artists, and thinkers have a critical role to play in imagining transformation. You might say it's our job. The lineup at this year's festival is nothing short of extraordinary. Roxane Gay, Masha Gessen, Hassan Minhaj, Paul Auster, R.J. Palacio, Jhumpa Lahiri, Eileen Miles, and many, many others, including our spectacular slate this evening. The festival culminates on Sunday in the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture, which will be given by Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, followed by a conversation with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Tickets are still available for many of these events, and we hope to see you across the city throughout the week. I'm honored to welcome you tonight in my role as rookie president of PEN America, a position I assumed last month. I first joined PEN as a young writer new to New York in the 1990s. Our mission, now as then, is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Today, PEN America is the largest of more than 100 organizations worldwide that make up the PEN International Network. We have members in all 50 states and offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. For those of you who are not yet members, please join us. It could not be easier, pen.org. And you don't need to be a writer to join PEN, simply a lover of writing. As a member, you will learn about our public programs and our literary gala on May 22nd, which will honor Stephen King and 2 journalists imprisoned in Myanmar for exposing a massacre in a Rohingya village. Finally, I'd like to thank the sponsors, supporters, and volunteers who make the PEN World Voices Festival possible. Thank you all for coming today, and my name is Jennifer Egan. Sorry about that. I knew I was missing something. I was saving that to disclose it at the end. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you to our sensational guests for agreeing to take part in what promises to be a provocative and enriching week. And now, please join me in welcoming Chip Raleigh, director of the 2018 PEN World Voices Festival.
In 2013, Behrouz Boochani, a journalist and poet and an ethnic Kurd, fled Iran after several of his colleagues were arrested. On the final leg of a very long journey, he was intercepted trying to make his way to Australia by boat. He was placed in indefinite detention on remote Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. He has been there now for 5 years, and although he has been determined to be a refugee, he has no hope of admission to Australia. Australia was one of the 26 original signatories to the UN Convention of Refugees in 1951. It once had a bipartisan consensus on the humanitarian treatment of refugees, no matter how they arrived. But today, Australia is no longer a leader in the humanitarian response. Instead, it is a leader in cruel deterrence. Globally, an unprecedented 65.5 million people are currently displaced around the globe, fleeing war, persecution, climate change, and famine. But how often do we hear from any of these displaced people? They're mostly anonymous, hidden from view. How often do we hear any of them express resistance to the circumstances they find themselves in? For Act 1 of this opening night of resistance and reimagination, please join me in welcoming Australian poet and author Maxine Beneba Clarke, who will read A Letter from Manus Island, a Refugee Resistance Manifesto by Behrouz Boochani.
Letter from Manus Island by Behrouz Boochani. For many months, the refugees living inside Manus prison have had to endure extraordinarily oppressive conditions orchestrated by the Australian government. During this time, the Department of Immigration used various strategies in order to force refugees out and transfer them into 3 new camps: East Lorengau, Hillside, and West House. They announced October 31 as the deadline for refugees to leave the place. That date signaled the beginning of extreme force and dictatorship. The government believed October 31 would be the date its vision would become a reality and its plans would be put into practice. When this date arrived, 600 refugees refused to transfer to the new camps. Instead, the situation transformed into a humanitarian crisis that lasted 22 days. For many watching the events on the island and in the prison from the outside, some central questions have arisen. How could we continue resisting without food, water, and medicine for 3 weeks? How did we keep the character of our protests peaceful throughout this period? How did we continue resisting without ever resorting to violence? From the standpoint of someone operating at the core of the resistance for this long period of time, that is, the whole 3-week period, and privy to everything that was happening inside the prison and the details of the resistance, I think the only thing that helped us persevere for the long stretch of time was our dedication to principles of humanity and human values. In the community meetings we held every day at 5 p.m., we stayed true to principles of love, friendship, and brotherhood. There was nothing greater for us than respect. There was nothing greater for us than equality and camaraderie. In reality, it was a resistance that was completely democratic. By democratic, I mean that every day at 5 p.m. at one fixed location in Delta Prison, we gathered and everyone had the chance to express their opinion with the group and discuss it. If anyone had a new suggestion, they could outline it and we would put it to a vote. As a group, we would consider whether the suggestion should be put into practice or not. Debates surrounding how to manage tasks inside the prison and the rules pertaining to the prison were also resolved by voting. This was in addition to deciding on other methods we should incorporate that could help stand up to power and continue our struggle. Throughout these 3 weeks, the gates were completely open and anyone could leave the collective resistance at any moment. They were totally free to go to the new camps and acquire food and water. We were particularly committed to the following point: no one had the right to reproach another for leaving us. In fact, We all had to thank anyone who left the community because they stood with us for as long as they were capable, and we were all grateful for that. Sometimes during this period, we smuggled into the prison a limited amount of food in the dead of night, and this food would be distributed equally amongst the prisoners. This principle also applied to the dogs that live among us. We factored them in. In our meetings, we were adamant about the fact we had to show even more compassion to these dogs than before, and feeding them was also imperative. These principles applied to the sick too. We cared for them now more than ever. And so the emotional connection and collaborative work began to take shape between special groups of people in Australia, numerous local Manusians, and all of us detained here. This collective sentiment developed into an important partnership in our struggle. During that 3-week period, special people in Australia united with many people on Manus Island and made attempts to deliver food inside the camp. Ultimately, this meant that the PNG police and Navy intensified their struggles as boats carrying supplies got closer to the main prison camp. The local Manusians also organised a process in Lorengau to support us. The protesters both in Australia and in Papua New Guinea are not the majority, but they are representative of the conscience of their societies. They are among the people who are socially and politically aware. In any case, the interrelations between the three communities, all with different cultures and nationalities, prove that there exist people with a sincere understanding of other people, no matter where they are in the world. It proves that there always exist significant people who transcend government ideologies. I imagine the rallies that were organised can be nothing more than messages of friendship and humanity. But apart from these spaces of solidarity and the alliances formed between societies, the question remains, what are the conditions and the framework that give rise to a resistance constituted by half-naked men on a remote island known as Manus? And what are the messages that our resistance is attempting to convey? The refugees are overpowered. The refugees have had extraordinary pressure imposed on them. The refugees have resisted an entire political system. They have stood up to the power of a whole government. From the very beginning right through to the end, the refugees only used peaceful means to stand up and challenge power. The refugees have asserted their authority. The refugees have claimed power. The refugees were able to reimagine themselves in the face of this detention regime. The refugees were able to re-envision their personhood when suppressed by every form of torture inflicted on them and when confronted by every application of violence. According to its own logic and consistent with the character it has molded itself into, the detention regime wanted to manufacture a particular kind of refugee with a particular kind of response. But the refugees were able to regain their identity, regain their rights, regain their dignity. In fact, what has occurred is essentially a new form of identification, which asserts that we are human beings. The refugees have been able to reconfigure the images of themselves as passive actors and weak subjects into active agents and fierce resistors. The concept of the refugee as a passive actor was an ideal instrument in the hands of power and could be exploited by Australia's political machinations. It formed the refugees into something that could be manipulated and leveraged for the Australian government's own purpose. The refugees have established that they desire to exist only as free individuals. They desire only an honourable existence. They have established this in confrontation with the proliferation of violence in the detention centre, one that is implemented by a mighty power structure. Up against the determination of this monolith, the refugees have ultimately vindicated themselves. They have been able to refashion the image of themselves as the other, We have reshaped the understanding of us as politically inept and have been successful in projecting an image of who we are. We now present the real face of refugees for a democratic Australia to discern. The refugees have found the response and reasoning provided by the government regarding the hostage situation and our incarceration to be absurd. There have been ridiculous fabrications. We have exposed this as a form of political opportunism, as a politics driven by economic mismanagement and incompetence, policies that benefit bloodthirsty financial investors, a politics that experiments in order to further ingrain a system of border militarization and securitization. The refugees have identified and exposed the face of an emerging 21st century dictatorship and fascism, a dictatorship and fascism that will one day creep into Australian society and into people's homes like a cancer. The refugees have been resisting with their very lives against the real politics of the day, with their very bodies, with peace as a way of being and as expression, with a rejection of violence, with a kind of political poetics, with a particular style of poetic resistance. These features have become one with their existence. Refugees pushed back, risking their lives and bodies, fragile humans risking everything that is beautiful, risking the only things left of value to them, risking what nature had bestowed upon them. They never gave up these things to become mere bodies subject to politics. In opposition to a system of discipline and the mechanization of their bodies, the detained did not surrender. In reality, they proved that the human being is not a creature that can be entirely and completely consumed by politics. From another perspective, this mode of resistance and the messages communicated by the imprisoned is nothing more than the refugees exerting and putting into practice their values and their standpoints. They took this stance in order to return something valuable to the majority of the Australian public, to return what it has lost or what it is in the process of losing. We formulated a schema of humanity that is precisely in polar opposition to fascist thinking, the kind of thinking that created Manus Prison. We have reminded a majority of the Australian public that throughout their history, they have only ever imagined that their democracy and freedom have been created on the basis of principles of humanity. If a majority of Australians were to reflect deeply on our resistance and sympathise with us, they would come to realise something about how they imagined themselves to be until now. They would undergo a kind of self-realisation regarding their illusions of moral superiority. They would be forced to self-analyse in relation to the principles and values they hold dear at this point in time and realise they are not connected to a mythical, moral past. Our resistance enacted a profound poetic performance. This persisted until the moment we were confronted with the extremity of the violence. We found that the baton-wielding police had killed one of the dogs we had adopted into our community, and at that moment we descended into sorrow and wept in honour of its loyalty, its beauty, its innocence. This profound poetic performance was implemented on another occasion when we were facing off against a group of police officers. We linked our arms to create a chain and told them we only had love for them. We recited this as a poem that then became a collective expression, a poem that united us, a poem that we chanted in unison, a poem of peace, a poem of humanity, and a poem of love. When the police chief stood in front of the community of half-naked refugees and named the leaders over the loudspeaker, asking them to surrender themselves, everyone called out, "I am A, I am Y, I am B." This was a scene that emerged in Manus Prison. On the same day that we were brutally bashed, a number of individuals placed flowers in their hair. A sick Rohingya man placed 2 red flowers behind his ears and smiled, even as his body was emaciated and in the worst shape possible. Our resistance was an epic of love. Ultimately, they beat us down, and with violence, put an end to our peaceful protest, but I think we were able to communicate our humanitarian message to Australian society and beyond. This sentiment is what all people, whether in Australia or elsewhere, need more than anything else these days. Feelings of friendship, feelings of compassion, feelings of companionship, feelings of justice, and feelings of love.
From remote Manus Island and contemporary Australia, we go back in time. We go back in time here and closer to home. In one of the most celebrated and powerful books of the past 2 years, Colson Whitehead reimagined the metaphorical Underground Railroad, one of America's most potent and enduring examples of resistance. Tonight, he talks to Annette Gordon-Reed, author of the Pulitzer Prize winning The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, about the creative imagination required to find the historical truth and how the legacy of slavery reverberates throughout history, from Jim Crow laws to the resurgence of white supremacy today. For Act 2 of this opening night, please join me in welcoming Colson Whitehead and Annette Gordon-Reed.
I'm going to read a short section that finds our protagonist, Cora, in Indiana. One of the conceits of the book is that each state that Cora goes through as she runs north is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels. I'm not like a big Gulliver's Travels fan, but for many years I would try to describe the book and people would say, oh, that sounds really dumb. And then when I started saying, oh, like Gulliver's Travels, they would sort of get it. She goes to North Carolina, a white supremacist state. She goes to Indiana, which for many years in my notes was called the Black Utopia state. And she's found herself on Valentine Farm in Indiana. It's a sort of a separate black community organized by some renegade free blacks from the East Coast who've come to start a new life. They're self-sufficient from the white town down the road. And they take in runaways. You can stay if you want to, or go on to the next leg of your journey. And every Saturday they have music and dancing. Sometimes they have poets, sometimes abolitionist speakers. And this night, a conservative black voice on the farm, Brother Mingo, who sort of echoes Booker T. Washington, has given his idea of what's next for the black race. And then Lander, who's a more progressive voice, comes up to the podium and gives his idea of what's next for Valentine Farm, and by extension, maybe black folks in 1850. Brother Mingo made some good points, Lander said. We can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't try. Sometimes a useful delusion is better than a useless truth. Here is one delusion, that we can escape slavery. We can't. Its scars will never fade. When you saw your mother sold off, your father beaten, your sister abused by some boss or master, did you ever think that you'd sit here today without chains, without the yoke, among a new family? Everything you ever knew told you freedom was a trick, yet here you are. Still we run, tracking by the good full moon to sanctuary. Valentine Farm, this place is a delusion. Who told you the Negro deserved a place of refuge? Who told you that you had that right? Every minute of your life's suffering has argued otherwise. By every fact of history, it can't exist. This place must be a delusion too, yet here we are. And America too is a delusion, the grandest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there's any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are. I'm supposed to answer Mingo's call for gradual progress, for closing our doors to those in need. I'm supposed to answer those who think this place is too close to the grievous influence of slavery and that we should move west. I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what we should do. The word we. In some ways, the only thing we have in common is the color of our skin. Our ancestors came from all over the African continent. It's quite large. Brother Valentine has the maps of the world in his splendid library. You can look for yourself. They had different ways of subsistence, different customs, spoke 100 different languages. And that great mixture was brought to America in the holds of slave ships. To the north, to the south. Their sons and daughters picked tobacco, cultivated cotton, worked on the largest estates and the smallest farms. We are craftsmen and midwives and preachers and peddlers. Black hands built the White House, the seat of our nation's government. How can one person speak for this great, beautiful race, which is not one race but many, with a million desires and hopes and wishes for ourselves and our children? For we are Africans in America, something new in the history of the world, without models for what we will become. Color must suffice. It's brought us to this night, this discussion, and it'll take us into the future. All I truly know is that we rise and fall as one colored family living next door to one white family. We may not know our way through the forest, but we can pick each other up when we fall, and we will arrive together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very, very provocative passage. When did you first learn about slavery? What were your first knowledge of the institution?
Well, I think, I think maybe vaguely in third or fourth grade when I first heard of the Underground Railroad. But I think like a lot of people of my generation, Roots, being on TV, I was 8 years old. I have 3 siblings, and our parents called us all out, and we watched Roots. It was 1977. And I guess since I traveled with this book, I knew it was a big hit here, the miniseries. But all over the world, like in Europe, that's how they first get their information about slavery, is Roots. So it would have been that, probably.
Did that make you think that it had anything to do with your life at the time, or was this something that was just the past?
I think, it was where we came from. It's how our parents framed it. In the same way, Richard Pryor was ours. We were a very TV-centric family. We got cable as soon as it was invented, so we didn't have to talk to each other. And so there's Richard Pryor, there's disco, there's Roots, and all those great black actors. And that's part of, there's history, and there's also our culture.
So from that, when you start to write something like this, how do you prepare for it? Did you go out and read lots of history books, or how did you figure out what it is that you should be addressing?
This is my 8th book. At this point, I sort of know sort of instinctually what kind of research I want to do. And in some ways, I was drawing on stuff I read in college about eugenics or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.
Yes.
That's where I first encountered slave narratives, and those stayed with me over the years. When I actually sat down to write, I'm pretty lucky that a lot of those primary materials, whether they're slave narratives or oral histories of former slaves, it's all digitized. I don't like leaving the house, so whatever research I can do from home makes me very happy. If you go outside, there's so many, people, and if I could
Oh, no,
avoid
not them.
that, I'm really happy. So a lot of great universities have digitized all these materials, and it's stuff that wouldn't go into a history book, but for a fiction writer, it's providing all the nouns and verbs and adjectives that, make the book sound real to me and hopefully to readers as well. Did we use buggy or wagon in 1850?
On that question of sound, how did you decide how they were going to speak? Because the speech that you're giving there, what do you think about the notion of slave dialect as a way of writing?
Yeah, I think, that scientific rendering of dialect, how we speak, our vernacular, North and South, always seemed kind of outmoded by the time I started writing. Why are you putting so much energy into imagining how people 150 years talked? Why take up this this rendering, which is often used by white racist writers to ridicule poor people, ridicule black people? And so, I try to preserve, what I know as black vernacular and the rhythms of how we talk, and then basically let the sort of dialogue fall where it is.
Yes, because it definitely allows people to know what they're saying, because it's never rendered in any way that remotely sounds the way anybody speaks. And the narratives, and I always suspected this, and it was confirmed by a book not long ago, that when they did the interviews, this is the WPA narratives done in the 1930s of former enslaved people, most of whom had been children at the time, obviously, when they were in slavery. If they brought back interviews that were not in dialect, they would send them back and make them put this into dialect. So that's why enslaved people from Texas to Georgia to Virginia sounded exactly alike. And you know that that's not true. So it was not really about authenticity in the sense of getting how these people spoke. It's really about, as you said, ridiculing, sort of defining blackness in a particular way. Authenticity on those kinds.
Yeah, and for me that was a real resource. It was the Great Depression, and they trying to get people back to work, hired writers to interview former slaves. And they, of course, are getting the slave stories and altered, but you always have to keep in mind who's actually doing the filtering of these life stories and their biases. And
So do you think were you thinking of politics when you write a book like this? The politics, sort of current day politics, and about representations of African Americans?
I think, there are some of my more contemporary work, like John Hemingses, or Zone 1, which is about zombies, but is also about how we live today. I am thinking about contemporary culture in a more direct way. With this book, it became apparent very quickly that if you're writing about 1850, you're also talking about now. Going back to reading accounts of slave patrollers. Slave patrollers were the police force before there was a real police force in the South, and it was their job to stop any black person they saw, basically, free person or slave on an errand, and demand to see their passes. And, I was struck by reading those first-person accounts of how slaves and former slaves 150 years ago would describe being stopped and frisked, basically. And it's the same language I've used when I've been stopped and handcuffed and interrogated for being black.
You've been stopped and handcuffed and interrogated?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are sort of stopped. You're black in the wrong place and in the wrong time. In my case, I was 16-year-old buying beer on the Upper East Side, and a white lady had been mugged, and I was the first black person that the cops saw. And so they took me out to the police car, and luckily, the woman said no, that wasn't him. But whether it's just driving while black or going to Starbucks, I think, so there's that continuum of humiliation from 150 years ago to now. It's in white law enforcement, white shopkeepers, and that sort of, it seemed, I didn't have to push the parallels between then and now, going back to your question. They're all sort of there.
But also, do you feel a responsibility to present African American characters in a particular kind of way?
No, I mean, Cora, our protagonist, is also often a jerk.
Well, yes.
I've had plenty of jerks in my roster of protagonists before. And for me, I render their humanity first, whether the character is much like me or not like me, male or female. I don't feel like a burden of representation. I feel growing up after the civil rights movement, starting to write in the 90s, I can have my first book be about black elevator inspectors and just be as weird as I want to be.
You have this thing about mechanics, elevators, trains. What's that about?
I don't know, just being, I can't explain it. I think it's definitely there. I think it's definitely there in the Intuitionist and John Henry days. And finding different metaphors to talk about the world. Strangely, even though the book is called The Underground Railroad, the railroad's like the least important part. I think if I'd written it 10 years ago, I would have spent more time in the tunnels.
Why?
But I think I was more in my sort of postmodern hijinks phase. And,
Postmodern hijinks.
Why be concise?
Is there any other kind?
Why not, embrace the encyclopedic novel and just throw everything in there? And I feel like in this book, I want to get Cora from state to state, and so the Underground Railroad is a portal. But definitely 10 years ago, I would have shown who built the tunnels and who dug them out and who did the right of way. And I felt when I was writing this book, I was in a different sort of mode when it came to concision.
So after you've researched, how long does that go on? Could it be months, years before you've done that?
For this, it was research and writing was like a year. So I researched for 3 months, and then there's always a moment where I'm very antsy to start working, and that's when I sort of know I have to begin. And then, the bad part about writing a novel is that it's long and tedious and soul-destroying. But you can always stop and take a break and do more research. And so there are characters who I didn't know would be as important, like Dr. Stevens, who I sort of flash back to his becoming a doctor in 1830s Massachusetts, and he's a grave robber to find cadavers. And so I could stop and do more research and, for example, and read Diary of a Resurrectionist, this, 19th century tract of a professional grave robber, and then go back to work.
Do you know how it's going to end?
I do. I'm always sort of writing toward the end. And then before I start, I do a lot of outlining. I have to know the beginning and the end. The middle can be fuzzy. But I'm usually...
So you know the beginning and the end. You've never started and then realized that I have to change directions or whatever as you're writing that sort of develops into something
because I
else.
do think about it for a long time. I sort of kick the tires. And so I've never gone to page 100 and realized, actually, this is a pretty stupid idea. Because I have plotted it out. And I guess in my dorky way, it seems it's hard enough to find the right words each day if I don't even know what's going to happen. So I outline a lot.
Yeah. So you sit down, you know where you're going, you know the characters. Do any of the characters change?
They do. I mean, I know most of the characters. Ridgway is a slave catcher. He's the antagonist. I knew he'd have a sidekick, but I didn't know until about 2 months before I got to the Homer part, his name is Homer, what he'd be like. And so I know the major characters, definitely small, some of the supporting cast gets bigger as I sort of figure out more about who they are and what they have to do. And I think I do outline a lot, but I have to be open to where characters take me. And definitely characters become more or less important as the book starts going. And
We were talking about resistance and continuities between the past and the present. What lesson did you learn, or have you learned about studying slavery that surprised you, or has been the most meaningful to you? Because I have to tell you, I'm very jealous of you as a novelist who can write about slavery, and you don't have to have endnotes.
Sure.
I mean,
Yes.
you do have to have, you have to do research, you have to, establish a degree of authenticity, but I have to kind of stay coloring within the lines to some degree, and you can go beyond that. But as you're going through this process, as you've gone through it, what do you think what has been surprising to you or meaningful to you, and what do you think most Americans should know about the institution?
Well, I mean, I think, the fiction writer has a job and the historian has a job, and I can make things up, and it is a great liberation, and definitely, I can't remember if the Fugitive Slave Act was 48 or 49. It's like, it goes away when I don't need it anymore. I think, in terms of slavery, how shallowly it's taught, I thought it was I didn't learn much about it in elementary school or high school. I think we had like 10 minutes on slavery and then 40 minutes on Abraham Lincoln. And then in high school, 10 minutes on segregation and 40 minutes on Martin Luther King. And I think now maybe we're up to 12 minutes and then 38 minutes. But I gave a talk last week and a woman came up to me and said, have there ever been studies about cave-ins? And I was like, cave-ins? And she's like, yeah, well, the tunnels were so deep and so long, and I was like, are you joking? And then, so she was in her 60s and had gone her whole life thinking that the railroad was real and reading my book and thinking it was real. And so we really know so little, about how it actually worked. And I think I had like my 8-year-old acquaintance with roots, and then in college studying some history. Coming to the material in my 40s, I realized as a grown-up, the true devastation and dehumanization of it. And I don't think we appreciate the violence it took to keep millions of people in bondage, the way it was so tied to the nation's economic destiny. I mean, and so as a 40-year-old, I can have my feminist, capitalist, postmodern acquaintance with slavery that I didn't have when I was 8. And I think in terms of being surprised by what we do and don't know, like in Europe, they connected abolitionists to people in the French resistance and the Polish resistance. And so, unfortunately, that dynamic between slave masters and slaves, whether it's royalty and peasants or aristocracy and serfs, travels. And so the story of this book traveled much more than I thought it would, just because that power dynamic has defined so much of history.
And so so you've been overseas and they make those parallels. Have you been to Northern Ireland?
I've not. I'd like to be
No, it's
invited.
just I mention it because they make a lot out of Frederick Douglass and anti-slavery there, and sort of tying it to their situation with the British. So it is, our example is something that goes, that travels, as you said. Yeah. So, but there are people, even in the African American community, who, well, there's certainly people outside of it who say, why are we talking about this? This was the past. Even if it was something that makes us, we know it's something that makes us who we are, the focus should be more on the future than thinking about what happened, rehashing what happened. And this is not, as I said, not just whites who don't want to talk about it, don't want to confront the issue of slavery. There are black people who say, look, I don't want any more slave movies. I don't want any of this stuff. Why don't we talk about something that's more uplifting?
Well, I mean, if you want uplifting, go see a clown or something. It's not my job. And I have been asked, like, why'd you write this book? Why a book about slavery? And I guess I could have written about white people from the upper middle class who feel sad sometimes. But there are a lot of people doing that already, a lot of competition. So, I don't think about how people are going to react to what I'm writing about. My first book was about elevator inspectors. I just try to sort of fulfill my own artistic needs. And
no, but I mean, not in terms of, your writing, but you as, can I separate you out from your writing, or just you
Yeah.
and thinking about politics and thinking
No, I mean-
about what should, as a citizen, as as citizens, what, for people who say, look, there are many things to be done. There, the road is ahead. We could be moving forward. Why are we talking about this? Now, so I understand as the writer, you choose your own subjects, but you as the person.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the book is about white supremacy and capitalism, and we just elected a white supremacist president. So it's incredibly relevant. We haven't come very far. We've come far in some ways. I don't think that a lot of people in this room expected how far we'd fall back in the last 14 months. And so we'll repeat the same mistakes. So.
We'll repeat the, we're, what do you mean, we'll repeat the
Well,
same?
I mean, if we don't actually look at our history and learn from it, we're going to keep doing the same thing, and we are doing the same thing.
How long does it take you to recover from your novels? For production? I mean, because then you go, right now, are you touring?
I've been traveling, but also working. I mean, I usually take like a year and a half off when I'm done with something and recharge and play video games and cook and brood. And then, and I usually, just as a safety valve, I'll do like a more, maybe a darker book, a more serious book, and then a book with more jokes. I mean, this book has the least amount of jokes per page, anything I've done.
Yeah, not a very funny subject.
So I was hoping to, for my next book to do something. I had a crime novel, I was very excited. And then Trump got elected, and I was like, no, I have to write something relevant, just another depressing book about institutional racism, just to address what's going on. So a year and a half went by, and I switched books, so now I'm doing 2 depressing books in a row. But in terms of keeping sane, it's keeping me sane and dealing with what's going on. So.
When did you discover that you wanted to be a writer? Is something you've always known?
Since like 7th or 8th grade, other kids like to leave their houses and do sports. I like to watch The Twilight Zone and read science fiction and comic books. And it seemed like, I think a lot of people in my generation who write either wanted to write the X-Men or draw the X-Men or be in the X-Men. And so my highest dream when I was like 10 was to write for Marvel Comics.
And you wrote short stories? Did you write comics? I mean, what did you,
I
how
wrote
did you
2 short
express this?
stories in high school. I wrote like 3 short stories in college, and we were talking before about those days, and you had to audition to get into the workshops in my college, and each time I applied, I was turned down, which made me very depressed, but it was good training for being a writer, because when you're a writer, everyone hates you, and if you internalize that hatred early, you're prepared when you actually get out into the world, so.
Was there anything else you ever thought of doing besides this?
Sometimes I'll look at an ad on TV and like, I could have been an ad man. And I think there's like a tradition of like Salman Rushdie and Don DeLillo did ads when they started. Either that or be like a music supervisor on a critically acclaimed but poorly rated TV show. Like, what do you play when they, opening credits, closing credits, montage sequence?
You're a native New Yorker. How did has the city influenced your artistic sensibility in any way?
Well,
Because everybody, I grew up in Texas, and the dream is always to come to New York. And Baldwin said, anybody who starts here, the dream is to go to Paris. So I had to get here. You're already here. Did you ever think about Paris, or is this a place, or is this a place that's, this is enough for you?
No, I mean this is my place, and I've written about the city a bunch, not in every book. I remember I was trying to get New York into the Underground Railroad, and I was depressed because it took place in the South, and I was very sad. Then I read Eric Foner wrote a book about the Underground Railroad while I was writing the book, and a lot of it takes place in a lot of it is about New York
Yeah.
and sort of legal strategies between abolitionist lawyers and slave catchers. And I was like, yes, Ridgway, the slave catcher, will come to New York, and I can get New York into the book. And I was very happy. And so it's just, it sustains me. I used to work at the Village Voice across the street, and I'm one of these people who's always just like, that was there before, and then, they switched it up, and and always sort of reliving my glory days of like 1985 whenever I walk around. So I'm here for good, unfortunately.
Yeah. What do you get opposition when you go out on tour? Do people show up to be critical on the basis of sort of the racial aspects of this, or do they just not show up to your? Are they mainly fans? No one is hate reading you. Do they show up to?
No, I mean with nonfiction, yeah, I think you get the protesters if you're on the other side of the divide. With novelists, no one really cares. I mean, if you come out, you pretty much like the book, and if you didn't like the book, you're probably home waxing your bust of Robbie Lee or something. So it's not like I go to South and there are all these like rabid racists hanging outside.
They don't write to you.
No, I mean, I guess through Goodreads and Amazon, like 1 star. Why are all the white people so evil? It's like, it's not really even true in the book, So, so they find ways to get me, even if they're not showing up.
Without showing up, Goodreads. Do you read reviews?
I think that the first third, I am curious. Then after that, I know generally how it's been received and can go on with my life. But I am always wondering if what I got on the page is actually there and visible for other people, or is it just me? And
Yeah. Do you take any of these things to heart? Have you read something, a review of your book, for example, and say, first, have you ever had any critical reviews?
well, I think
Maybe not, yeah. I'm
no,
trying to think.
I
You don't.
have.
Nah.
Like there's one from like John Henry Days, my second book, which is now like 17 years old, and I stopped being mad about it like last week. So that stayed with me. But usually I think a negative review is dumb and I didn't get it. Sometimes someone knows how to get in there.
But that's what I meant to say, didn't ask it the right way. The people who get in there, have you learned something from it? Have you said, that's right?
No.
That's good.
Maybe 10 years later, they had a good point. But, you should have told me before I published the book. I could have used your advice then, not after I write the book.
Do you show people your work?
It depends. I mean, I think I can get through like the first third before I have to show my wife or my editor or my agent, and then hopefully they'll be encouraging and I can go on. With Sag Harbor, which is about growing up in the 80s, was very personal, and so each time I finished a chapter, I would show my agent just because I felt really exposed. But generally, I can power through with whatever kooky idea I'm doing, and then get to a third, and then I can get to the end.
What people would have you had mentors, people who are, who helped you or inspired you, or actually, people that you show things to? And
Yeah, nobody was really helpful though, when I was starting out, frankly.
Wait a minute. Nobody was helpful to you?
No, I mean, I couldn't get into writing classes. Like, I never had a professor like, I like the cut of your jib, Colson. Let's go out to lunch. When I think of my inspiration, it's not a teacher or someone who reached out. It's Stan Lee creating Spider-Man. It's Toni Morrison publishing Beloved in '87, so I could read it in '88 when I was sort of open and trying to figure out how to write fiction. It's Prince for putting out Purple Rain in '83 and providing a soundtrack to everything I've done, since then, from homework to books to,
So no mentor.
No mentor. I mean, I had an editor at The Voice who was interviewed, and I was like, I was Colson's mentor. And I was like, you gave me a job, but you weren't like you're my boss. Like, you weren't, A mentor takes you out to lunch. Obviously, I'm really bitter.
I was going to ask that. That was my next question. Has this bothered you that you didn't have a mentor? Were you sitting there thinking, why don't I have that? I like the
It's
cut
one
of
of
your
many
jib when you're
disappointments and things I keep close and brood over. So it's really,
Yeah. So, well, I suppose in some ways that could be inspirational to people to know that it is possible to make it without a mentor, because anything you read in any profession, they tell you what you have to have is some, a godfather or mentor type person, and you're saying no. So what did you just do? Just wrote and sent things out? Wrote and got an agent?
Well, I wrote and it was terrible and no one liked it. And then I wrote another story and everyone hated that one too. And then I stopped for like a year. And then I went back and was like, you just keep going.
Yeah.
I mean, the same thing as now. I mean, I'll write a book and it'll get good reviews or bad reviews. People will get it or not get it. And then it's just you again. And there's not a mentor saying, good job, Colson. It's just really you, day after day, sort of putting it together, because no one else can really do it for you.
No, they can't do it for you. Have you been a mentor to other people, or have people sought you out as a mentor, and have you accepted the seeking out?
Well, there's something about my face where I have office hours and no one ever comes, really. But the door was always open. I've taught at various places and have had a lot of great students, and some people I've been helpful to, I've been told, so it's been nice.
Where have you taught?
For the last 8 years, I was visiting at NYU and Princeton, teaching creative writing. I'm not a good literature teacher. Basically, if I try and teach a book, I just say, this is great, what do you think? There's not a lot of expert pedagogy involved. So, but with workshop, I actually like talking about their stories. A lot of the people who are taking the class want to be architects or engineers, and they're just taking the writing class. They think it's a gut, and they're always better at the end. And they're pretty terrible that first week, and they're reading Laurie Moore and Gino Diaz and George Saunders for the first time, and getting stuff out of it. So I'm enjoying it.
So, how would you like to be remembered as an artist?
He was nice to his wife and kids.
No. Besides that, as a novelist, what do you think would you like for people to say that you've contributed to the canon?
I think I'm always very flattered when people say, I read the script of your book and it sounded terrible. Then I read it and it was actually surprisingly good. So.
Wait a minute, no one's ever said that to you.
Yeah. Like elevator inspectors, what is this?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd like to be remembered. He was a good cook. He was nice to his kids. I think that's more.
And you put together good sentences?
And, he tried to write some good books.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette and Colson. From the historic and present-day United States, we journey now to contemporary middle-class France to hear from Leila Slimani. Her novel Chanson douce, translated here as The Perfect Nanny, ignited passionate debate in France for its subversive examination of motherhood, race, and social inequality. The first Moroccan-born woman to win the Prix Goncourt, she is now President Emmanuel Macron's ambassador for Francophone affairs. For our third and final act of this opening night, where we resist and reimagine, please join me in welcoming Leila Slimani, who talks to the New Yorker's Adam Gopnik about her work and a life remade through immigration and literature.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Good evening. We were just talking backstage. We've just met, though I've had the great pleasure of reading Layla's work over the last 10 days or so. We were talking about first experience of Paris, and it turned out we had similar, though coming from very different backgrounds, similarly parallel experiences. You couldn't believe the people kissing.
Yes, French kissing, because
Yes.
it's not just kissing and showing you're kissing, and that maybe something is going to happen after kissing.
Yes.
And that was
The full universe of
yeah.
kissing. of
And I was
possibility.
16, coming from Morocco, where people don't kiss in public. I've never seen people kissing in public. And I was like, the police is going to come. They're going to get arrested. And then, you know, they are kissing and drinking wine. And I called my mother and I said, it's very weird here, Mom. People are drinking and smoking in the streets. So, you know, I was very stupid and very naive. And, you know, now when I look at the photographs, my outfits were terrible because, and I suppose that Parisians were looking at me and I was not Parisian at all at this time.
How long did it take you before you actually were living in Paris?
Many years, many years. It's a very difficult town to conquest. It's very difficult because you don't understand. There are a lot of codes. And as I was telling you, for me, Paris is like a stage.
Yes.
You know, and everyone is acting, and everyone is trying to do his best and to tell you, you know, you're an outsider. You don't understand, and I want you to know that I understand that you don't. Yeah. And I was looking at those women, and I was like, wow, they are so beautiful. You know, getting out of their apartment with the high heels, and they run with the high heels, and then they take their bike and they go to have a glass of wine, and they are never drunk, and they smoke a lot, and they have a very beautiful skin, and you're like, it's not possible. And their children are so nice, they play violin, and they are very polite. And I was like, I want to be one of those women. But then I met those women, and I became one of those women, and I discovered that they drink wine, and they are drunk, actually. And sometimes they vomit, and sometimes they are alcoholic. And their skin is not so beautiful in the daylight, so, you know, it's not
right.
that's extraordinary.
It's all right. That's so funny, Layla. I remember a dear friend who was a philosopher in Paris, and we used to play tennis, but he couldn't walk from the tennis courts in his shorts to a cafe because someone would see him in his shorts, and a man of his philosophical grandeur could not be seen with bare knees at a cafe. And
that's the Parisian, exactly.
Yes, totally. Come back, if you would, Layla, and tell us a little bit, because you started talking about your upbringing. I have a quote from you. You said once, I grew up in Morocco, I was born a Muslim, and every year I celebrated Christmas in a big white house in the country, halfway between Meknes, is it, and Fez. Tell us about that childhood.
I was an outsider in my own country because my parents were very particular, and they gave us a very different education from the education many Moroccan children have. Because my mother, she was half Algerian and half French. My grandmother came from Alsace, and my grandfather was an officer in the French army, and he liberated the little village where my grandmother was living, and she came to Morocco in 1945. She was very tall, and my grandfather was very small, and he was very dark, and she was tall with green eyes. It was a very weird couple, but very funny. And my grandmother, she learned Arabic, and she was speaking Arabic with a very, very accent, an Alsatian accent. It's like a German accent.
And she's speaking Arabic with an Alsatian accent.
Yes. Salam alaikum. She was speaking like this, and people were a little bit frightened. And she was very tough, you know, because she was living in a colonial society, very racist, and she was married to an Arab. And she was like a white woman married to an indigene, as they were saying. So she couldn't get along with the French people.
Not sure, but how had they met? What was their romance?
During the war. During the war. Right. And it was funny because they met in Alsace, and my grandfather, he fell in love with her, this little guy, very dark, from Algeria. And he was a Muslim, so he couldn't drink alcohol, and he couldn't eat charcuterie. And my grandfather said, oh, that's the only problem with him, is that he he don't eat pork. I don't care about the rest, but you know, the choucroute is so good. I can't trust a man who don't eat choucroute. And he was very shocked. And so they got along. And my father, he's from a more traditional family from Fez, the center of Morocco. But you know, my
A more traditional Muslim family.
yes,
Right.
traditional Muslim family. My grandmother and my grandfather, they couldn't read or write. So for me, it's very weird. You know, today I'm in New York speaking about my book, and my grandmother, she couldn't read my book.
Couldn't read at all.
Just two generations.
Just two generations. No, I think that's replicated in the lives of many American writers. But just coming back to that for a moment, because it's the first question to ask about a writer and the kind of imagining a writer really does. What were your languages? What did you speak? What did you read?
I was speaking French with my parents. I was speaking French because my father, he went to the French school. He was a very good student. So the French, you know, they picked the good students. They are not stupid. Right. So they picked the good Arabs who speak very good French. And so he studied after in France. And it was very difficult for him because I think that all his life he felt he was a sort of a traitor. And he had
a traitor to his people.
Right. And to his family in particular. And so he had very difficult relationship with his family. So we didn't spend time with them when we were children. So we were a very weird family, speaking French, speaking of freedom, so reading a lot of books, drinking alcohol, eating pork, traveling.
Actually, there was choucroute on the family table.
And my father was a feminist. He was not religious. So it was very weird because I remember that when my Moroccan friends came to my house, they were like, wow, that's so weird the way you are living, because I was speaking with my father. When I was not okay with him, I would tell him, you know, no, I think that what you're saying is stupid. And all my friends were like, oh, you said stupid to your father, because in Morocco, you have to respect the father a lot. So there were very different education from the average Moroccan.
Did you have a sense, Leila, growing up, of being in some sense an exile from your own country? In other words, being at a remove from the
Yes, I was,
experience?
and I am still an outsider, and I am still a minority. You know, in Morocco, I don't represent the majority of Moroccan, and sometimes it's very difficult because when you fight for example, I fight for the sexual rights for women, for the right for abortion. People tell me, but you're not a real Moroccan because you're just a minority. You represent no one. And at the time, I believed them. I was like, okay, they're right. I'm no one, and I can't speak for them. But now I think that my legitimacy don't come from the fact that I am a bourgeoise or I am a francophone. I have the legitimacy of what I believe in. And I think that what I believe in is fair, and that people should have rights, and that women should be equal to men, and that we should inherit the same that men, and we should have the right to abort. So I don't care about the fact that I'm not legitimate.
Yeah. Right. What were the books that meant most to you? What was your first experience of literature that made you think this might be what I want to do?
You know, I thought this might be what I want to do because my parents loved reading and they were passionate about writers. And when I discovered the life of writers, when I read about the life of Baudelaire, of Tolstoy, of Maupassant, I was like, what a life. Wow. Drugs, sex, passion, overdose, suicide. Wow, that's a life.
That, by the way, that's tomorrow night's theme. Drugs, sex, passion, overdoses.
Come back.
Tonight's we're a little more respectable.
I didn't figure that actually you have to write to be a writer, and that you have to work. So when I discovered this, it was more difficult. But I loved the fact of being a writer. The romantic figure of the writer.
You came to France. You had your first experience of Paris. You came to study in Paris. First at Sciences Po, right, at the great school of political science.
Yeah, exactly. I came to Sciences Po, so in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a stupid and naive little Moroccan girl in front of a very Parisian and very self-confident people who tell you, oh, did you read this morning l'article in Le Monde saying that? I was like, what is he talking about? I don't understand. And you know, people in Paris, it's very difficult because they say, okay, do you want to have a coffee with me? So you have a coffee. It's winter, it's very cold, it's the holidays, and they have the coffee and they say, oh, you know, I have to go, my family is waiting, bye-bye. And they go, and you're a stranger in this city, and no one is inviting you, and you feel very, very, very lonely. It's very difficult to make friends there.
Yes, it's there's nothing lonelier than 7:30 at night on a January night in Paris. At that
Yes.
cafe, in fact.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, I remember the first time I went to the floor. I was like, I have to go there. I went there and I was alone. And I sat, and many people, very famous people, was around me, and I felt so uncomfortable. But I said to myself, you know, you have to stay here. You have to stay here for 1 hour, because if you're not able to do so, you will never succeed. I had this very weird feeling, and I stayed 1 hour. I paid, I remember, $12 for coffee. And I was like, I'm not going to tell my mother that I paid the coffee, so that it was so expensive. And I went home, and I had this feeling, I did it.
You did. You succeeded
Yes,
at the first
a
step.
woman alone on a terrace in a cafe, which is impossible in Morocco, and I did it. And I smoked, and wow, it was great.
A good night's work. One of the things I admire very much about your writing, Leila, is that you've operated both as a citizen and as an artist, and you've kept the two, if not independent, you've kept them quite distinct in your own work, your responsibilities as a citizen and your work as an artist. And that's reflected, I think, in your formation as well. You worked as a journalist and then as a young novelist. Is that true?
Yes, as a journalist, you know, you have to deal with reality, with real people. And in particular, in a country like Morocco or in the Maghreb countries, it's very difficult because people think that the most important thing is the appearance must be saved. You must save honor, and they don't want to see the reality. And I consider that my work is to make it impossible for them to avoid this reality. And when I tell this reality, I mean the women who are raped, I mean the abortion, I mean the homosexuals, I mean all the invisible people that they don't want to see. The problem in our societies is that you give a mirror to someone and he won't look at his reflect, he will break the mirror. Mm-hmm. So my work is to oblige him in a certain way to look at his reflect in the mirror. So I consider my work as a journalist that my duty is that. But for me, literature is completely different. It's a sort of sacred place for me. It's a space of absolute freedom where I can reinvent myself, where I can try just to understand the soul of a human being without judging him, and really try to explore what it is to be a human being today or in any place. And I think also it's a place of universality. You can cross the borders. You can cross every difference of culture, of race. I don't care when I write. I can write about everything, and I love this about literature. So for me, I like this sentence of Sartre, you know, a writer is a free man who speaks to a free man and whose only topic is freedom. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly the definition of literature.
No, it's wonderful. Which leads us naturally to your novel, Chanson douce, which won the Prix Goncourt 2016. You can only win it once in a lifetime, right?
No, actually, Romain Gary won it, yes, because he lied.
But he lied. He made up a name and a false identity.
Maybe one day.
So we'll keep our eye out for.
I will have an alias. Why not?
When Slima Lalina wins the second prize, wins one too. Speaking of freedom of imagination, this book, which is a phenomenon in so many ways and in many languages, just translated now into English here, is an act of wild freedom of imagination, because you set yourself the task of imagining probably the single worst thing that a parent, at least, can imagine. What was the genesis of this story of murder and misunderstanding in your mind?
You know, the beginning was that I wanted to write a story about a nanny. I was raised by a nanny in Morocco. She was living with us, and I called her Mouima, which means little mom. She was a sort of second mother for me. And I can remember...
Did she come from an Arab background?
Yeah, she was Berber, actually.
Berber,
She was
right.
Berber. And I remember that when I was a child, very young, maybe 7 or 8, I could feel that her position in the house was very weird. I could feel that she said, "Oh, my children," to us, but I knew that I was not her child. And she said, "My house," because she was living in our house, but I knew that my house was not her house. And everyone was telling her, "Oh, you know, Mima, you're a member of the family." And even as a child, I knew that it was not true, and that one day she could leave and my parents, they could fire her. So, you know, all this very ambiguous position fascinated me, and I wanted to explore this in a novel. And then I became a mother myself, and I did, like in my novel, I did interviews in a Saturday afternoon with many women to hire them to become a nanny. And I met women coming from the Philippines, Ivory Coast, very far, women who knew much more thing about life than me. I was feeling like a baby myself. I was 30 and I was stupid. My son was a very little baby, and those women, they knew so much. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be the boss of one of these women. I'm going to tell her what to do. I'm going to give her money, and I felt...
Older than you, with more life experience than you.
And I was feeling very uncomfortable, and I found it very weird, this situation, so I wanted to write about this. And you were speaking about fear. You know, my mother was a very, very, very anxious mother. So my mother was always like, "You're going to die, you're going to get hurt, so I don't know how to ride a bike, I can't drive, I know nothing," because my mother was too anxious and she was always sure that something was going to happen to me. And I was very angry against her when I was a teenager because I couldn't understand why she was so afraid. And I remember that when I gave birth, the first thing that I felt when I looked at my son was fear. Immediately, before love, I felt fear. And I understood what my mother felt. And I was like, okay, Mom, now I know. And I had the feeling that this fear that everyone feels when they have children, this very primal fear, exists everywhere, but at the same time, we don't speak about it. It's a little bit taboo. When you meet your friends, you're not like... okay, are you too afraid that your child is going to die? No, you can't speak of this.
It's unspeakable, it's a taboo.
Yes, it's unspeakable, because if you think about it all the time, you can't leave.
Are you afraid that the nanny might kill the child?
Yeah,
yes, is truly a taboo subject, right?
Yeah, but you can't speak of it. Right. And I think that literature, the aim of literature for a writer is to say to the reader, please tell me that you feel like me. Tell me that I'm not alone to feel this. So in a certain way, I wanted to share this fear and maybe to give it to the reader to get rid of it. Thank you very much.
To violate the taboo, exactly, in order to embolden the reader. What makes, like, as with any book worth reading, what really makes this book is its style, the beauty of its sentences and the tone. It has an astonishing first sentence. This book is, the baby is dead, le bébé est mort. And I was thinking as I was reading it, because your prose style is, in your literary work, is remarkably, beautifully neutral and descriptive in that way. And I was wondering if it's probably a crazy thought, but I was thinking of course, one of the most famous first lines in all of French literature, the first line of L'Étranger, Camus, mother died that day. I wondered if that was even remotely in your mind as you did it, as you wrote.
You know what's weird is that when the book was out in France, a very famous journalist said, and I love this quotation and this reference to Camus. And I was like, what reference to Camus?
Well, there are two of us then.
And he said, yes, the first sentence, obviously. I said, oh, yes, obviously. But actually, I've never thought of it. I've read it many times. But when I wrote this chapter, I've never thought of it. But I think that maybe in my unconscious somewhere, I was influenced by Camus, of course. But when I wrote it, no. So I said to the journalist, yes, you're right, of course.
Yes,
but no.
It's always, when they praise you for a citation, you just take the praise and you don't argue with the critic. But it is the case that the book, in a deeper way, the sentence aside, is very much the material of L'Étranger, that is about the inexplicable nature of murder, the inexplicable nature of violent death intruding into a seemingly normal world.
Yes, and also the fact of being an outsider, feeling of...
Well, the nanny is really a metaphor in a sense
Yeah.
for everyone for you in a way.
She's someone who wants to belong. She wants to belong to something, to someone, to a family, and she's always outside. She has the feeling that she's always fighting against walls and that she can't get really inside. So yes, she's a kind of outsider, and her loneliness reminds also of the l'étranger. So
Yes.
of course, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, it's very powerful. Also, the structure is extraordinary because we begin, it's almost Hitchcockian. We begin with the climax in a way, and then we have to work our way back to find out how this could have happened. So we know the result of the story at the very beginning. We know the conclusion, and then we have to find our way back through it.
Yes, but you know, when I wrote the first version of the book, it was not like that. So I was like, okay, you're going to write a book about a nanny coming to a very nice family. So I wrote, and very quickly I discovered that my book was very boring. Because I must say that the life of a nanny is very boring. It's very repetitive, very trivial. When you take care of little children, you do the same thing every day. You change diapers and you prepare la purée. And then when I wrote a
You
chapter
push them in the
about
poussette, and then...
so I wrote a chapter about the parks, a chapter about the purée, and I was like, so what now? And the problem was to find a narrative tension, to find something to interest the reader, and to make him look at the little details of the everyday life, and to put a sort of in comfort. And when I discovered actually the New York case, the murder of the 2 children, I was already writing the book, and I said, okay, I have to begin with the murder, because I have to face also this violence that is included in this...
Is implicit
yeah,
in the
is
relationship.
implicit in this relationship.
Right. So the idea of the killing came when you were already underway on
Yes,
the
yes.
material.
And it saved
That's
me, actually,
Right.
yeah.
Well, but it's also, as I say, it's extraordinarily resourcefully done because it's not because you lay all of your cards on the table at the very beginning, so we know what the story is going to be about.
Yes, but I think that then the reader has to be the investigator. I like the idea that the reader has to be very active when he writes. So he's the one who has to figure out why she did such a monstrous thing and how did it happen. So for me, it's very important for the reader to be very implicated in the lecture of the book.
Yes, absolutely. As I said, I want to talk both about your work as an artist and as a citizen. We have the chance tonight because those are the 2 powerful ways, I think, in which writers imagine. Coming to something that's more about citizenship, there's something that you wrote in this wonderful book of short pieces, Le Diable est dans les détails, Devil is in the details. It's interesting to think God is in the details as well, right? So who doesn't reside in the details? You wrote in a remarkable short essay, polemical essay called November 18th, 2015. It's written on November 18th, 2015, and it's called, courageously, Fundamentalists, I Hate You. And let me read you, if I may, which I quickly and probably poorly translated this morning, some of what you wrote. I have only one thing to say. This is right after the Bataclan.
Few hours after, actually.
Really, just a few hours, not even a day after. No. I have only one thing to say to the barbarians, to the terrorists, to the fundamentalists of all kinds. I hate you. We owe it to ourselves to be whole, to keep our cool, to be truly French. We have an obligation to say this to our pretended allies, including the Saudis, the Qataris, and to all those other countries where every day the backward and the misogynists gain more ground. We have to say it to those who buy our arms, sleep in the comfort of our palaces, and are received on the steps of our institutions. How to explain to our children that we are fighting the barbarians when we ally ourselves with those who crucify their own people and mutilate women? How to explain to them that we are being killed now for our values of liberty, of feminism, of tolerance, and of love for humankind, when we ourselves seem unable to defend those values? Those are extraordinarily powerful and beautiful words. I know what provoked them, but what gave you the impetus to feel that you needed to bear witness to that moment?
You know, as I said before, I've lived in a country that is burned by the poison of hypocrisy, of lie, where people lie about their sexuality, about the fact that they drink alcohol, about the fact that they are not religious. Everyone is acting as everyone is lying, and I'm sure that lie is killing us, and that hypocrisy is killing us, and that silence will not save us. And I'm outraged by the fact that we always sacrifice the same people, the women, the homosexual, the poor people, and I think that I have, of course, to stand for them, and I have to, now that I have a voice, I have to give them my voice, and I have to oblige people to hear them. So, of course, and you know, when I was in Paris just after the attack, I remember that I met an Algerian friend. He was living in Algeria during the terrorist years, and his mother was...
In the 1990s?
In the 90s, yes, and his mother was killed by Islamists. And he said, you know, I came to France because it was a sort of refuge, a shelter for me. And they came and they attacked my idea. And they shoot my idea, he said. And that's it. You know, I came from Morocco because for me, France was a country of liberty. That's a country where I can sit and drink a glass of wine and smoke a cigarette and kiss and French kiss a man and even a woman if I want in the street. And that has a value. It's not nothing. And for me, it's impossible to let people attack this. And I will fight for this. And they fight for their idea. Why shouldn't I fight for my idea? And you know, we should never forget that terrorism is about terror. If we are afraid, they win. So I will not be afraid, and I will always say what I think, because I don't want them to win. It's impossible.
Well, if I may finish the passage, in fact, that I was doing, because you say that again beautifully and making it plain that those Enlightenment values, those humane values, aren't simply things we live as abstractions, but are also things we have to inhabit every day. And you go on to say, today more than ever, I take the measure of the beauty of my city, this city that I would not trade for any paradise that those madmen of God promise. Your fountains of milk and honey are not as valuable as the Seine. Paris is all that you hate. Its sensual and delicious mix of languages, of skin tones, of religions. Paris, where we kiss full-mouthed on the benches, where one can hear at the back of a cafe a family dissect its political opinions, and we can end the night in flirtation and love. This night, the night after the Bataclan, our theaters, our museums, even our libraries are closed. But tomorrow they will open again and will be up to us, the children of the country, disbelievers, infidels, or simple flaneurs, lovers of idols, drinkers of beer, libertines, and humanists to write our history. Isn't that beautiful? Yes.
Thank you.
Leila, that's one of the most beautiful practical affirmations of humanist values that I've read in a long time, and I think we all thank you for it.
And you know, for us, coming from Muslim countries, it's very difficult to assume the fact of being drinkers of beers and infidels, but we have to fight, and we have to tell it, and we have to say, because if we don't, the others win, because they have the courage, in certain way, the courage to fight for the idea. So it's very important for us, even if we are threatened, and even if it's very difficult to write those things.
Well, it's very, in the context of what we're talking about tonight, that affirmation of those humane values can come from someone who does not claim them as, so to speak, as birthright, but as acquired right in some way. It's learned right, makes them all the more moving. And well, we could talk all night, but we don't have all night, unfortunately. So I do want to ask you again, in the place where citizenship and artistry meet, about your, the role you've taken on for President Macron as his personal representative to the French-speaking countries. How did that come about, and how do you conceive of the role you're going to play?
Actually, I accepted his proposition because when I wrote my last book, Sex and Lies, The Sexual Life in Morocco, a lot of people accused me of being a traitor to my country, to my culture.
Excuse me, just to say, this is Leila's latest
and they
book.
say, and
Sex.
She writes in French. She writes in French, and she speaks French, so she's a traitor. She's not a real Moroccan. She's a traitor to her culture. And the Islamists who hate me as I hate them, the Islamists said, oh my God, she's not a real Moroccan. And you know, I think that's terrible, because what they say is that you have one culture, one book, Quran, one horizon, one country, and nothing else. If you speak French, it means that you're attracted to those depraved Western countries and to this culture that is our enemy. And I hate this idea. And I think that telling this to the youngsters and to the young generation, it's a crime. And so I want to fight for the idea that you can learn another language without being a traitor to your culture, and that, of course, you can cross borders, you can learn French and Spanish and English if you want, and you can travel, and you're not, and you know, I think that we are not our culture, but we make our culture. We are the actors of our culture, so we can change it, we can transform it. So that's why I accepted, because I think that's very important to stop being in this kind of war, Morocco against French, post-colonial countries against Western country. I think that it has made a lot of damages, and that today we should also fight for universality and for the idea that we can speak to each other, that I can learn English, you can learn Arabic, and that there is no problem. We are not threatening no one, we are not doing something wrong.
Right. I can't help but ask you, did the appeal to do this come directly from the president, or were you, how did it happen?
You know, actually, he proposed me to be the Ministry of Culture, and I was like, what?
This rarely happens.
I just gave birth to my little girl, and someone called me one day, and I said to my husband, no, I'm not answering, I don't know this number. And then I listened to the voicemail, and I said to my Antoine, I think it's the president. And he said, your little girl, she just vomited on my shoulder. I don't care about your jokes. It's completely stupid. And I was like, no, it's absolutely serious. So I went to his office and I met him. It was very weird, full of flowers because he just won the French election. And he said, what do you think about culture? I was like, and you? What do you think about culture? So that was funny.
And he offered you Malraux's position, the Ministry
yes,
of
but
Culture.
I said, no, I don't want to be a minister. I don't want to be in the government. I don't want people to judge me every time. And I want to do whatever I want. I want to go out and have a party with my friends and do whatever I want.
Right, and make real culture,
yes,
not official
exactly.
culture. That's inevitably, Leila, those of us who are living through the ongoing and unending national emergency of American political life right now, look with some envy and wonder at what's happening in France right now. I know you're directly involved as an emissary of President Macron, but what do you see as the possibilities and the risks of France right now, particularly with an eye to the question of minorities, laïcité, and all of the values that we argue about and think about?
I think that the first main issue, of course, is terrorism. Just 1 month ago, we were still attacked by terrorists. So I think it's the main issue, and the issue, of course, of Islam, of terrorist attacks. So that's something that is very, very urgent. And the whole French society is worried about this, and I understand it completely. But, I also think that we have in the US and France, everywhere, our democracies are in a very bad moment and a very difficult moment. I think that we have maybe to redefine completely how to be a democracy today. Now, when I read things about this Facebook scandal and everything, I think that we can't now govern the same way as 50 years ago. So I think that Emmanuel Macron is very aware of this, but he's, like everyone, is trying to figure it out, but it's very difficult to find solution to this. So I think that there is a structural problem that we are all facing. I don't have the solution, obviously, and I think that he doesn't have the solution, but we have a lot of issues, yeah.
Yes, no, it's striking, isn't it? Because in every country, ones that survived the financial crisis well, ones that didn't, ones that had very different histories, Britain, France, Canada, my native country, the United States, all have been undergoing a similar kind of political crisis, which seems to suggest it's sort of deeper in the geopoetics, so to speak, of our time, rather than just in the geopolitics of our time in that way. Leila, I'm told, believe it or not, because this is raced by, that we're out of time, but I have to ask you a question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind, as it is on mine, because we talk about universalism, cosmopolitanism. Where did you master such perfect English in the course of this?
In Morocco, actually,
Really?
Yeah, in Morocco. You know, I was afraid when you said I'm going to ask you a question, because last time I was in a classroom and one student, he said, I want to ask you a question. It was about my book. Do you have children? Are they alive? Because he wanted to know if it was autobiographical. And I said, no, they're not alive. He was very afraid.
Did you study English in school, or was it
No, but
music
you know,
and-
I love cinema, and I watch a lot of American movies with my father, and now a lot of TV shows. So I write sometimes, but I watch a lot of American movies, so I think maybe it helps me.
It's been several generations now of Francophones
Yeah.
who learn their English from American movies and British pop. Layla, congratulations on your book, and Layla Slimani, on behalf of all of us, welcome to America.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Please stay on stage. Just for one moment, I'd like to invite our earlier speakers, Colson Whitehead, Annette Gordon-Reed, and Maxine Beneba Clarke, for one last ovation. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. This is the opening night of our festival. There's a whole week of activities for you to take part in. If you don't have your tickets yet, penworldvoices.org is where to get them. And immediately after this event, we will have book sales and signing in the lobby. So please join us there, and you might get a chance to ask a question of one of your favorite writers. Thanks again to all of you for joining us here tonight.